Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. We're going to begin today's program in the garden. It's nearly the height of the growing season, and many gardeners are already enjoying the fruits and vegetables of their labors. One crop that is planted in the fall is garlic, and it's ready to harvest around this time of year. But there's a warning. Our garden expert Leonard Perry tells us about a pest that loves garlic.
Garlic is one of the crops that we love. My wife and I love to grow at home in these raised beds. It's just really easy. Of course, you plant it in the fall, which is different from a lot. And you don't use the supermarket garlic. You use the bulbs. You buy just seed garlic for planting. You see the rows are about a foot apart, about 4 inches. And with very little care, a little fertilizer in the spring, can end up with some beautiful plants by early summer and midsummer that look like this. So a couple of things. You see this netting. You say, why the netting? Well, there's a pest that is fairly recent. It's called the leek moth. And it's not just leeks. It likes anything in the allium, the onion family. Onions, shallots, garlic, chives even. It loves garlic in particular. I first learned about it on leeks. It was first found actually nearby in Plattsburgh, New York in 2009. And so it's in the area. And it will come in, and what it does is the moth flies in May when the days get above, nights get above 50 degrees, and it will lay eggs. The eggs hatch. Little larvae will tunnel in and start chewing on the leaves. You can look for their remains of the chewing there. If you actually clip those out, they start with the early growth, so you want to catch them early, and then you cut that right out, and you can actually slit that open and find a little larvae in there. What you don't want is that to continue, because they'll just take down the stems and maybe get into the bulbs, especially with the late season ones. Of course, garlic you're going to harvest about the middle of July usually, but onions and leeks you're going to leave in until the end of the season. A second generation comes along in July if you let them. Those little larvae then eventually pupate, turn into moths, and make another generation, starts over. And then those larvae can actually get in and go right down. And that's where I first learned one year. I was trying to grow some leeks, and they looked gorgeous. End of the season, within a few days, they were down on the ground. I said, what happened? What did I do wrong? Well, then I found out it's a leek moth. Had taken them out in a matter of days. And so that's why you use some insect netting. You can find this online. You can use the remade, the spun-bonded material, like used to cover a lot of edge crops, keep pests out. But this is nice. I like it. Lasts many years. It costs a little more, but not too much, but it lasts many years. Make a simple frame out of pipe here. Use some binder clips. You can just get it at any kind of home store, find online. And just cover that. You can see in there, see if you've got a problem, see if you need to open it up and do some weeding. But the other key, not only to getting on early, which I seldom do, and that's why I see some problems start. I didn't get this on quite early enough, but also tight. If there's a little gap in the bottom, that moth will find its way in. It really pretty smart that way, and it'll get in and lay its eggs. You'll have damage. So tight edges and a nice good cloth here, and on early enough are some of the keys to keeping that leek moth out. And then hopefully you'll get some really nice garlic. If you do get it in, again, catch it early, just clip that out. Another thing you may be noticing here, some wires on the outside. Should mention what those are for. We have, of course, some chicken wire here for the rabbits. Now, if they really want to get in here, some beds have had to use actually rabbit wire, which is much thicker gauge. They don't chew through that. They can actually chew. I've seen them chew through that, make holes. But this is more for deer. The deer don't see too well, so they may not see the black. They should see the white, and the white simulates a deer's tail in the breeze or fleeing, so that supposedly helps scare them away too. So the deer don't want to get in, so the rabbits, these are raised beds. We tend to rotate our crops, so they're all covered with this. They may not like garlic, but they might like something else we have green over there. So just a simple control you can use for that small area. You can get by for deer with these lower covers. So if you think you have any problems like the leek moth, feel free to contact local garden stores with trained nursery professionals. Are a real good source of information too and answers to your questions.
Thank you, Leonard. Our next segment focuses on the upcoming elections and voting during the pandemic. Across the country, officials are dealing with the unique challenges caused by the coronavirus and trying to come up with solutions to ensure the integrity of our elections and safe access to the ballot. Students in the UVM Reporting and Documentary Storytelling program spoke recently with political science professor Lisa Holmes about voting access during COVID-19.
This is the picture, I think, that has come to symbolize this whole fiasco. This photo, I think, represents better than maybe anything else what happened in Wisconsin last week. There is a voter in Milwaukee noting that this was ridiculous. As many of you surely remember, what happened in Milwaukee in particular was that there were only 5 voting stations out of 180 that were open for people to vote because, of course, the difficulty of rounding up people to actually staff all of these voting stations, leading to long lines for people who wanted to turn up to vote. But what is really going on in this picture, I think, in this photo, is being driven because of the partisan wrangling associated with how to handle voter access. So what does all of this have to do with November's presidential election coming up on November 3rd? Well, this partisan wrangling between the Democrats and the Republicans over how to handle voter access, ease of voting, the prevalence of mail-in voting, what IDs should be required to be allowed to turn up in person to vote, all of this kind of stuff has been raging for years between the two political parties. What all of this is really about, and has been for years, is the ongoing war between the Democrats and the Republicans over how easy to make access to the vote, especially during a pandemic. President Trump has even weighed in on this recently with this tweet on ballot harvesting. Ballot harvesting is a particular kind of voter fraud. It's not about when an individual turns up to vote illegally. Ballot harvesting is the concern that somebody might be collecting a whole bunch of mail-in ballots or a whole bunch of absentee ballots, let's say, for example, from an assisted living facility, and fill them in themselves or in some way manipulate them. That is what President Trump is talking about in that tweet. But this also ties into allegations that he has been making for years of concern over widespread voter fraud. But to talk about mail-in balloting in particular, on one level, it is fair to say that mail-in voting is more challenging to pull off in a secure fashion. On the contrary, we have 5 states right now that vote pretty much uniformly through mail-in balloting, and these states do not report widespread problems. Ballot harvesting is something that happens. Probably the most high-profile recent example of this surely was in North Carolina in 2018, when a congressional election had to be run again the following year after evidence surfaced that a Republican political operative had been collecting ballots surreptitiously to help the candidate that he supported. But again, it's not really a widespread problem. And as I've already mentioned, states that do mail-in balloting far more frequently and regularly have developed good mechanisms for reducing or even eliminating these kinds of problems. Another thing I think is important to mention here is that when the two political parties or members of those political parties talk about concerns over voting, they're also very likely being self-interested. Democrats think that easier access to the ballot helps them. Republicans think that easier access to the ballot hurts them. President Trump has even said this. So all of this is also kind of mired in the self-interest of the two political parties. My take on it is that I don't really care about their particular self-interest. And here's why. I think that the answer to these questions about whether to make voting access easier or harder, especially during a pandemic, is that we should make it easy. We are supposed to be a representative democracy after all. And what we know is this: there is a lot of evidence that in-person voter fraud, an individual showing up at the ballot to vote illegally, is a vanishingly rare problem. I would never say that it never happens, but it does not happen in any kind of substantial numbers. Things like ballot harvesting are a different concern for states that are thinking about moving towards a more substantial mail-in voting system during this current pandemic. Again, those elections can be more challenging to pull off securely, but the states that do this, including Oregon, including Utah, have shown that with thoughtful planning and preparation, those problems can be overcome. So my take on this is that states should be seriously considering doing what they can to make voting in November both safer and more accessible. And ideally, they would get some backup and resources from Congress for this. Congress is not going to provide this backup and these resources, but in an ideal world, we would be planning for this November election better than we probably are in order to prevent things like what happened in North Carolina with that ballot harvesting example in 2018, but also to prevent people like this voter having to show up in person when doing so might put their health at risk.
Once again, our thanks to students in the UVM Reporting and Documentary Storytelling program for producing that segment with Professor Holmes. The Reporting and Storytelling program is part of the Center for Research on Vermont in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. Once again, thank you for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. Stay well.